Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm finally going to be diving back into debunking the bad arguments of race realism, because number one, it's bad science used to mask bigotry, and number two, the hate comments I get posting these are just so delicious. I used to think that debunking flat earth brought out the crazy assholes, but the ones I get when I refute this bigotry are just beautiful. Anyways, if you like the video or if you hate it, let me know, and for more in the future, feel free to subscribe. Now, on to the topic at hand. Race realism isn't anything new, though over the past decade it's seen a real resurgence in popularity across the US and in many parts of Europe. Although the endemic xenophobic acrimony expands well beyond just the subject of race realism in particular is a good place to look clearly at what the claims are behind these movements and others like it, and break it down piece by piece. Thus, with this topic, I'm going to be breaking it up into three parts. The first one, that you're watching now, will tackle what race realism is and the proclamations that it makes. In the second part, I'll be looking at why it's seeing such a resurgence, and the third will be looking at the consequences of such an ideology garnering a stronger following over time. So with all that being said, let's jump into what race realism is all about, shall we?
It can be divided in two areas. One is race realism, and race realism is the recognition that race is a biological fact. It's a phenomenon. It's not some sort of sociological construct, which is the trendy way of viewing things. No, it's part of biology, and it's also part of individual and group identity. And societies ignore the importance of biology and group identity at their peril.
So to start, what are the primary and central claims of race realists? What elements of their claims have some credibility and evidence, and what are the elements of their claims that are entirely baseless or completely misconstrued? Let's start with the three major claims themselves. Number one is that there is a scientific basis for race. Number two, that there is a demonstrable evidence of differences in the abilities of different races and the abilities between races. And number three, that quote-unquote white culture has the right to defend themselves from what they consider to be forced diversity. And expanding that a little bit, that whites deserve a place to call their own. Here's a clip from Taylor describing it as such.
I think whites deserve a homeland. Whites deserve a place in which they are the unquestioned majority, in which they can pursue their destiny free from the unwanted embrace of people unlike themselves. And I think all people should have that right.
So let's take these assertions one by one. First off, is there a scientific basis for race? Well, yes and no. First, we need to clarify what's meant by race. In the 17th century, it was commonly used to define and distinguish between certain groups based on nationality, origin, language, and other factors. By the 19th century, it began being utilized in physical anthropology. People like Cuvier, Pritchard, Pickering, and a number of other anthropologists at the time began describing quote-unquote races of men based on phenotypic traits like size, skin color, eye, and hair color, as well as the shape of skulls, which assisted in perpetuating the pseudoscience of phrenology. These early anthropologists could not come to an agreement on the number of supposed, quote, races of men, and the number varied between 3 and 11 during the time. The 5 most frequently used in common discourse came from a number of different places, but the one that I'm using here is Johann Blumenbach in 1779. They were Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and the American, or quote, red race, which should give you an idea of how superficial their understanding of biology was at the time. We've come a long way in our understanding of phylogeny, heritability, but the classifications of old generally remain mostly unchanged. Nowadays, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, and Native American, or indigenous/Pacific Islander, are broad categories applied currently and are often used in census data and intakes in medical offices and other types of places where categorization is considered to be important. And they are utilized because they do provide some benefit in providing broad demographic information, because certain aspects of these classifications can be useful in terms of broad categorizations. However, these classifications are still primarily based on phenotypic traits. And the more and more we understand about our own genetics and phylogeny, the less and less these categories seem to apply, particularly in the way that we utilized them in the past. The races that we classify today have far more to do with outward appearance than they do with actual genetics. There are a number of different places that tackle this in a number of different papers, but the one that I decided to use here gives a fairly straightforward synopsis and comes from Vivian Chu from Harvard University. This was published in 2017, and as always, links are in the description below. Quote, "The old concept of 5 races, African, Asian, European, Native American, and Oceanian, according to this view, variation between races is large, and thus each race is a separate category. Additionally, individual races are thought to have relatively uniform genetic identity. However, actual genetic variation, human populations do roughly cluster into geographical regions. However, variation between different regions is small, thus blurring the lines between populations. Furthermore, variation within a single region is large, and there is no uniform identity." In other words, there is some geographic variation between genomes, but the racial categorizations we use are based on perceptions and not a lot on actual genetic data. Genetics has shown us that there is far more genetic variation within races than there is between races. And not only that, the phenotypic characteristics that we use to classify these tend to not be indicative of what the genetic variation is between different populations. So, with all that being said, does this mean that race is entirely arbitrary? Yes and no. Or perhaps no and yes. The traditional classifications of race we typically see defined are social constructs. They're not genuine categories of ethnic background. But there are some important variations within some ethnic backgrounds that can have a real impact on the livelihoods of individuals within that background. 2 clear instances that we can look at are Tay-Sachs and Sickle cell anemia. Both are traditionally attributed to specific groups of people. Tay-Sachs is a neurodegenerative disease found predominantly in 2 populations, the Ashkenazi Jews and the Irish. The disease starts within the first year after birth and tends to lead to blindness, paralysis, and eventually death. 2 key points here to notice are, first, that the disorder is found in 2 seemingly disparate populations, showing the population genetics and migration patterns do not clearly transcribe to our anachronistic interpretations of racial categorization. Second, that there is benefit to knowing one's ancestry, particularly when planning a family, but the traditional classifications we use for race have little to do with effectively understanding our genetic history. Sickle cell is another example. Although the trait is considered to be an attribute exclusively found in sub-Saharan Africa, this in fact is not the case. It is also found in populations in India and other regions of Eurasia. In both these cases, the trait follows the ancestry of a particular region in relation to the area's prevalence of malaria, but does not apply specifically to the traditional categorizations of race. In other words, the distinctive lines we draw between populations and describe as race are an archaic value that's not representative of actual human ancestries. The fact is, you can look at 2 different people in Africa and they will have far greater variation than that person from Africa and a person from Eurasia, or a person from Eurasia and a person from Japan, or a person from Japan and a person from the New World, or North America as it were. And much of this is information that we only can clearly recognize now that we can actually look into the genome and understand our ancestral histories. The funny thing, of course, with all this is that through our understanding of our phylogeny, we realize that our entire population of Homo sapiens derived out of Africa roughly some 70,000 years ago. Meaning no matter how white you think you are, if you go far enough back in your ancestry, you're black. Simple as that. All of us originally came from Africa. So now that I've dealt with the first argument and why it's a misrepresentation in the context that they're utilizing it, let's look at the far more controversial claim that attributes can be ascribed to different racial groups, such as IQ, scholastic and employment success, criminal behavior, and overall well-being. This is an argument that's persisted for ages, and one of its most consequential presentations, particularly in recent history, was in the controversial 1994 book The Bell Curve by Richard Herenstein and Charles Murray. The book has been immersed in controversy ever since its publication, namely due to its conclusion that there are statistically significant differences in IQs between different ethnic groups. I don't want to delve specifically into the hornet's nest that is, because it's a mess, quite frankly. But for the sake of this argument, it's also irrelevant. Let's say, again, for the sake of argument, that I simply grant the premises. Not that I actually agree that it's the case that race and IQ are biological in nature or inextricably linked, but rather that for the sake of this argument, it really does nothing to support the goals of race realism. So below I have some links to material focusing on this issue of race and IQ specifically, including information on the success of certain quote-unquote black demographics achieving above and beyond their white counterparts, particularly when they are recent immigrants from a foreign nation and are compared to natives of that particular area. It's fascinating information to look at, but the primary takeaway from all of it is that the idea that there is an inherent genetic component to the intelligence of different groups of individuals seems to ignore every other environmental factor that seems to have a far greater impact on the outcomes than any type of genetic information or heritability ever really could. But honestly, for this, I don't need to rely on any of that information. Again, for the sake of argument, let's say that there is a genuine gap in the IQs between the races that we've arbitrarily classified. First off, how intelligent a person is and how successful they are may be correlated, but there's definitely no direct causal link.
Now, I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack.
We are also praying for the people of Puerto Rico. We love Puerto Rico.
It's got to be in tip-top shape.
As bad as that hurricane was, and that was a bad one, that was a big water job, right? It kept coming in and going back, they couldn't get rid of it.
We have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas.
Even in general terms, a lower IQ does have a negative impact on success later on in life, yet it's not indicative of the success or failures of any individual. There are plenty of examples of successes among those who aren't very intelligent and failure among those who are highly intelligent. This fact touches on a far deeper problem with what the alt-right's entire argument bases itself on. That problem being that they take these broad and arbitrary categories and use them to quantify merit. Merit is not something that's quantifiable based on assumptions like these without requiring a tremendous amount of dishonesty on the part of those perpetuating the narrative. Moreover, even if it was possible or reasonable to do so, it tells you nothing about any given individual. Just because a person is categorized by this narrative as black, white, Asian, or anything else, that does not say anything about the merits of that particular individual. Same with a person that's categorized as white based on these arbitrary metrics. Why? Because people are individuals, not homologous groups. Trying to push this narrative of better and lesser races is about nothing more than a means through which insecure, disenfranchised, and angry people attempt to provide a scientific backing to their narrative. But the narrative is the exact same one that's been used for millennia to affirm the in-group and dehumanize the out-group. We did it with the Japanese, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Russians, the Italians, the Irish, and of course black people. Historically, whether it be in underestimating our adversaries like we did in both Japan and Vietnam, or in the ineptitude of marginalizing talented individuals based on arbitrary external characteristics. Just looking at America's history with eugenics should make this issue crystal clear, in that we tend to marginalize people based on outward appearance, not based on their actual aptitude or skill set. And if people are given equal opportunity to flourish and thrive, those that are able to do and those that can't don't, regardless of race, national background, ethnic origin, gender, or any other type of broad, arbitrary categorization that we like to apply. Finally, we can look at the purported right of people to self-segregate. To some degree, this right is already in place. We have the right to freedom of association, the freedom to marry who we choose. The complaint often espoused is focused more on what is considered to be forced diversity through affirmative action and employment and education, being the most frequently cited one that I often see. I personally do have some issues with affirmative action much more how it's implemented in the United States rather than its goals. But the fact remains that this is not their real concern. Rather, it's a mask through which to re-emphasize segregation, that people should stick to their own quote-unquote kind.
I've already described, whites must have some institution, community, territory in which they are the unquestioned majority, in which their culture is recognized as the one that is central to the way that community operates. If diversity is such a great thing for America, why not for Pakistan? Why not bring in some Hindus, some Indians? You know, your country, your original country, fell apart over diversity.
This is my original country, sir.
As you can see from the delightful Mr. Taylor here, the same old arguments repeat themselves. Just like every other time before, the case being made does not comport with reality. We can look at the data from when our country's education system was most integrated and see the improvements among minority students, with no decrease in performance with the white students. Unfortunately, as busing programs begin being dismantled one by one, the problem has been resurfacing as schools have become more and more segregated, and the funding for education has become disproportionately applied to certain schools with more affluent neighborhoods, while the poorer neighborhoods are left behind. We also see that second-generation children of immigrant parents almost unilaterally outperform the expectations of their supposed races, particularly when access to education is relatively balanced. Additionally, from an economic standpoint, segregating our workforce by something like race or any other type of arbitrary classification is anathema to the very things that made us successful as a nation. Throughout our nation's history, we have all benefited from the innovations of the best and brightest of our country, regardless of their perceived race. These are all people that would not have contributed to our country's accomplishments if the race realists' ideal policies were put in place. Because, in spite of their tremendous accomplishments and their clear aptitude and intelligence, they have the wrong skin tone. Therefore, they are considered to be biologically inferior to other groups that should apparently receive more attention. With all that being said, finally, this all runs in direct contradiction to what our country was built upon, both socially and constitutionally: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, America itself obviously has a very dark and complicated history with the treatment of other races. That's irrefutable and cannot be dismissed or taken for granted. Whether you want to look at the African Americans, the Chinese, the Native Americans, these are very real elements of our history that ignoring would be doing a tremendous disservice to both our nation's history and the history of those who suffered under those types of rules and experienced such subjugation for such an extended period of time. All that being said, one need look no further than Benjamin Franklin to see how much the perspective of founding father can change in the course of one lifetime. The man owned slaves for many, many years, saw them as nothing more than an investment property, essentially. Yet 7 years before the end of his life, he penned this about black children and education. Quote, "I was on the whole much pleased, and from what I then saw, have conceived a higher opinion of the natural capacities of the black race than I had ever before entertained. Their apprehension seems as quick, their memory as strong, and their docility in every aspect equal to that of white children." A mere year later, he articulated quite eloquently what the principles of this nation aspire to be. Quote, "Much less is it advisable for a person to go thither, to America, who has no other quality to recommend him than his birth. In Europe it has indeed its value, but it is a commodity that cannot be carried to a worse market than that of America, where people do not inquire concerning a stranger, what is he, but rather, what can he do?" We are not a perfect nation. We never have been, and we probably never will be. But we can see the benefit of egalitarianism in opportunity throughout our entire history. Whenever we provide greater equality of opportunity to all people, regardless of their perceived race, the greater rewards we reap. So, frankly, if these bass-backwards ideologues obsessed with giving whites a place to call their own want that, well, good luck trying to make it happen here. The fact is, America is not a white country, any more than it's a Christian country. So if you truly want to wall yourself off from inclusion and equality of opportunity regardless of race, good luck with that here, because as a nation, we will fight such behavior tooth and nail every step of the way, no matter how much you want to clothe your nonsense in such patriotic overtones as Richard Spencer likes to do.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
You're really only going to get laughed at every time, particularly anytime that this happens.
What? It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Okay, so this is starting to get long, so I'll cut this one here. As always, feedback is welcome in the comments below, and thank you all for any feedback you have to offer, and I'll see you all next time as we dive into what has made the popularity in race realism resurge over the past decade or so, and why it is that that's continuing to escalate as we watch.